Hey everybody and welcome back. Let's jump right back in and continue where we left off with this sim that we created from a ready template and a little scene and a little render setup to have this kind of stylized black goo falling between the pillars. And what I arrived at is I don't really like the way that this scene is looking. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to build and make some different kind of scene instead. So let's move the view flag to the collider and let's maybe leave the sphere templated so we see it. I don't want this grid of pillars since we're not really seeing the liquid. I think I might want more like a circle. And when it comes to copying to points, we can use, for example, a circle, and we can plug it straight in. And you'll see that this is a circle that is standing. So if I put it on the ZX plane, you'll see that the darker side is the back side of the normal. So you see it's facing downwards. And I can rotate it either on Z or X by 180 degrees. Then I look on my collider again. I kind of copied everything to the points. Really, all we're doing is taking the points that this surface has and ignoring everything else. But it still doesn't look quite the way we want it to. So what we want to do is we want to have these pillars stand up in a circle and kind of orient themselves along the circle. And there are ways we could kind of manipulate the normals, and there are conventions in Houdini as such as if you expect something to follow the normal of an object, then the object you're copying should be aligned with the Z-axis. But in this case, I'm just gonna kind of leave that for later and just go copy to curves instead. And we're gonna still use the circle as the target curve, and then we're gonna use the box. And now when we highlight the copy to curves, we see that they've formed a nice circle for us. And this is something we can work with. So let's get rid of the copy to points for now. It's done its share for this little project, and just going to take a look at the grid and make sure we're on the ground plane. So the match size is doing that for us. Let's get rid of the grid and scatter, and let's look at the circle and just kind of bring it closer. And then I'm going to go to the box and I'm going to lower the uniform scale of that as well. Perhaps this is going to be too much of liquid, but yeah, let's see where we are. I think we might also want to change the shape of the box by doing some simple modeling operations. But let's jump to the first frame and highlight the flip solver by placing the render or the view flag on the flip solver. And just clicking back to start again to the range so it updates the collision object. And let's see what happens with this. I'm going to use the flip book right away. It's going to appear on my other screen here, and that's going to allow us to play this back in real time, because we still have, you know, not a ton of particles, but a little higher resolution than what we can play comfortably in real time on the timeline. So this is starting to look like some kind of a macro shot that could be nice to render as a little project. Kind of like the star shape that it's forming. I like that it's splashing up against the other objects. I don't so much, well, I feel like we might want an object that kind of has a lip, so it kind of helps the liquid to travel upwards. We can do some basic modeling changes to the box to achieve that. So let's go back to the start, or let's rather look at the box in itself. And I'm gonna get rid of the point display. So we had some axis divisions here. Defaults are 222, which is just, you know, a single polygon for each face really. So if we start introducing some axis divisions here, just a few, so I have like a base skirt that I can work with, and then I want to kind of flare this out and make a rounded shape. So the way we're going to do that is really just be aware of the fact that you can lay down nodes in the node network as we've been doing it before, let's say I want to select this bottom polygon and just kind of scale it out. So let's do that in the node network, and then I'm going to show you an alternate approach. So if I put on a transform, and in the group section, I can just click this arrow here, which is going to allow me to make a selection, and then I press the enter key. You'll see here that the group has updated to include primitive number 11. That's just because the default group type is primitives, and then the selection is to select primitives or polygons. So I've done that now, and if I do a uniform scale operation and actually view my transform as well, you saw nothing changed. You'll see that this is now starting to scale out. I particularly don't want it to scale in the y-axis. I only want it to scale in z and x. So what we can do is we can just force this. If I click, I'm going to zero out the uniform scale, so leave it at 1. And I take the scale x and I select the number, and then I click and drag it into the z-axis, and then I let go and I say relative channel reference. This is now copied to, use whatever value is input in the x-axis. So if I middle mouse click and drag and change it, and remember to view the transform, this is now affecting only z and x and not the scale y. So this is something we can work with. Let's do this another way. So instead of laying down the transform node here and selecting the group, we can actually lay down nodes in the viewport as well. So move back the view flag to the box, and now I'm going to press the S key for select, and it's currently at primitives for me. You can use the 1, 2, 3 keys to go to primitives, or 4 even as primitives. So if I just select this in the viewport, and here in the viewport with my cursor, hit tab, hit transform, and shift and enter, you'll see now this node was laid down for me, and it's already been set to include group number level of primitives. And now I can start tweaking these values as I did before. Relative channel reference. So I kind of save that step of laying down or picking the group after laying down the node. So I'll use that transform node for now, and now let's do something similar. Let's go back to select, and let's press the 3 key on the keyboard to go to edges, and then I can double click to select this edge loop, and then I can tab and start typing polybevel. And it's been laid down after my transform node, and you see my view flag has also moved to the polybevel. So I'm going to start editing this distance value. It's going to give us a bevel, which I want, and then I'm going to start introducing some divisions. And then I can kind of alternate back and forth between this bevel and the transform where I did the shape. We could even consider laying down a bevel node for the entire object to get some of these sharp corners rounded off. And if you start pulling on the distance, it's going to, oh, apparently I had a group selection there, so I'm going to just select this value and delete and enter. But we don't want to bevel everything. I'm going to go to the exclusions rollout and say ignore flat edges. And just enabling that changes something, but if we start pulling up this value here, you'll see that now we're only getting the hard edges. But it is including my already beveled areas, and I don't want that, so I'm going to put this before. So now it's beveling this, which is nice. I'm going to play a bit with the maximum normal angle. And I'm also going to bring down the distance because it's way too much, so we can actually see what it's doing for us. So this is what I wanted. I wanted the corners to be rounded off. And now I can go back to my polybevel, and you'll see that this is now not really doing what I expected it to do. It's suddenly beveling over here, and that's because we're using a non-procedural workflow here. we have hard-coded it to use these edges. And the bevel operation upstream changed those edges. So we either need to adhere to some kind of a procedural workflow, or we'll just have to reselect. And in this case, we'll just reselect for simplicity's sake. But we need to be aware that if we change things upstream, we need to go back and probably redo this selection time and time again. So that's a consideration that we're making. But before we reselect, I want to give some more divisions to the upstream bevel. We're going down to the fillet section and just pulling on these divisions, like so. And then going down to the downstream poly bevel and just clicking this arrow again and double clicking on that edge that I want and hit enter. So now we both have the rounding and we have bevels to the hard edges. Fair enough, not the prettiest thing in the world, but let's go to our collider and see what we have. So since we have a match size downstream, if you recall, we were actually pulling this bevel underneath the grid, and we have a match size that just aligns everything to be on top of the grid. We can rest assured that it's sitting on the ground plane, but the skirts of our newly changed objects are a bit too big, so I kind of want to put a transform node afterwards. And we could have, of course, have tidied this up and been a bit more careful, but it doesn't matter if we add a transform node downstream. Maybe if we were to clean this up, we would kind of do this transform operation after the fact, but we don't really need to be that careful for this little demo project. I'm going to go back to the flip solver, make sure I'm on frame 1, and let's see how our sim changed with these new collision objects. So let's do another flipbook. I'm really liking the shape of this. It's kind of organic and nice, kind of splashy. What I'm not liking so much is the fact that this is a completely perfect sphere before it hits the ground. So that's something we can tackle. And we're going to also revisit some of the settings on the flip simulation, as well as adding a little more detail, because you see that these droplets are pretty big, and it's not going to give us all the detail we want once we render this out. Otherwise, I think this is, you know, a nice little project that we can carry on and render eventually. So let's cancel that flipbook, go back to the start, and let's consider this sphere then. So just going back, I don't need to be viewing the flip simulation because it's going to take longer to update. And I don't want it to be so uniformly shaped. So what we're going to do, and you're going to see this as literally every beginner tutorial, is the mountain node. It used to be called mountain. So the command is still mountain, but if you lay it down, you'll see that this is actually an attribute noise set to change the P attribute, which the P attribute is just the position of each individual particle or point of your object. And if we move our view flag to the mountain, you'll see the result of this. So this is starting to look a little more organic. We can go down and revisit some of the settings on the actual mountain or attribute noise. The element size is going to make, you know, the noise shapes smaller. So if we pull down the element size a little bit, we get kind of more detail on our droplet. And the amplitude is going to change how much effect this takes. So I do want kind of a lower frequency, or higher frequency rather. So I'll pull down the element size a little bit more. We can be a bit careful with the amplitude. And once we've set that, I'm actually going to do like this is going to be my smaller details, and then I'm just going to duplicate it and pull it in so it affects the upstream, and then I'm going to do the larger details on this one. I'm going to go to the cog and revert to factory defaults. Actually, the factory defaults of the attribute noise is to change the color. So let's rather just lay down another mountain and pull it in. And this time, yeah, we have those big shapes. Let's see if it's something like 0.8. Just pull down so that the underlying shape is not uniform either. So we're kind of adding these together now to get some sort of organic shape. It's still a bit coarse, so we can either just lay down a smooth, which smooths the P positions, and then we can lay down, if we needed to get more detail, we just go back to the sphere and up the frequency to, let's say, 20, which is a little crazy for just our emission object, because it's not going to affect, it's not going to be a faceted liquid sim, even if we have a low-res object. But we can definitely spare this this polycount. There's not too much of an impact. So let's just start like that. I think I want to go and bring down the initial scale a bit. So I tweaked a few things between the previous sim and this one, and what I arrived at was a sphere uniform scale of 0.18. I actually tried to bring it back to 0.2 because I felt like you still want a fair amount of liquid, otherwise it kind of becomes, you don't get so much water splashing up. Just revisit the mountain settings. I went down to uniform I went down to amplitude 0.09 and element size of 0.48 for the bigger scale one, and for the smaller scale one, I do want to bring up some of the detail. Let's just look at it after the smooth. Something like that. Quite a lot higher to 0.039, and element size is still 0.05. And let's see if it's alright if we drop it. If we raise it back up to 0.9. Ultimately, if it builds up too much velocity, it's gonna require a lot more sub-steps because liquid is gonna start passing through the floor. What we want to do now is see if we have an interesting action, and then we're gonna start adding more particles. You'll see that this is giving us a lot more nice detail now, and this is still, it's not real time, but it's still very interactive, so we don't have any issues raising the detail even more, so we get a nicer mesh in the end. So I'm currently at a particle separation of 003. So 0.002 instead. It's going to give us in the beginning 6 million particles, which should not be much of an issue. Instead of watching this with the collision ghosting, I might go into visualization, turn that off, and look instead of a merge between the collider and the flip solver. So we see the objects as they're going to be rendered. You can put it on the color node for the collider. Give it a brighter color, maybe not that bright, but this is essentially not necessarily going to change the render, just for debug. Yeah, let's see with that higher particle count what kind of detail we're getting, and if everything is still functioning and not breaking. So you'll see that we're now at maybe 10 seconds per frame or something like that. It's starting to take a little longer, but we're still going to get some pretty nice detail out of this. So I can't wait to see the flipbook. And this is of course going to depend on the type of computer you have. I'm on a Ryzen 5950X with 16 cores. And this is, you know, still handled pretty comfortably. It's more or less a consumer CPU, so Houdini is very efficient when it comes to dealing with higher particle counts. In the end, it tends to be the RAM that is the limiting factor. But we're not going to run into that issue here, I think. My RAM usage is currently around 32 gigs. For this scene. I suspect there might be a few particles that built up too much speed and kind of escaped underneath the floor. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to be too visible. I'm just going to keep this as is. What you can do to try to alleviate that is adding more substeps, which is of course going to take more time. I'm currently already doing max 3 substeps, so I don't really want to add any more for the sake of this tutorial. But for your own result, you can experiment with adding more substeps, or just lowering the emission object slightly or making it slightly smaller. That way, maybe it won't build up so much velocity before it hits and travel too many voxels per substep so that it actually implodes or kind of escapes a collider. But I'm generally pretty happy with this. I think we're at a point where we can just kind of recache. But before we do that, I want to think about how I'm going to render this. So I probably want to see this detail in a little bit of slow motion. You know, not super slow-mo. But what if we, before caching, put the global animation options to something like 60 frames per second. We haven't made any keyframes or anything like that, so there's no real caveat with changing it. And we want, so this is currently just 2 seconds at 24. So let's give ourselves at least 180 frames. You don't have to do this, by the way. You don't have to do it in 60 the way I'm planning to. You can choose to stay with 24 and the 2 second. I just want to try this. So we already have a cache node. I'm going to save the scene and hit save to disk in background and let that run its course. And I just wanted to bring up that when you're caching things out and you want to kind of debug, you can click this folder icon. It's going to open up the folder in your OS file viewing utility. And I can see now, if I look at the date modified, I can see there is less than a minute per frame, so I'm pretty happy about the computation times. I can see the file size per frame is, 20 megs. It's going to get more when this actual splash occurs, but not too much more, I think, because we haven't enabled any kind of mechanism that adds more particles when there's more detail in sim. So we're going to leave that for later and just let this run its course. And we'll see how long this is going to take. So just jumping ahead while the cache is running, it's done with 27 or so frames. And looking at the water balloon file cache is not particularly useful because it's ran through the fluid compress. But what is interesting to look at is the particle fluid surface. And it is always expensive to mesh liquid sims. But something I noticed was it was taking quite a while, and we can look at optimizing some of the settings. But one thing I do want to be aware of is the fact that some of the particles are moving so fast that we don't have enough substeps to contain them. They're managed to escape through the ground plane. And I'm not a big fan of that, partly because those particles are going to be removed from the simulation. I still think there's interesting detail in the sim, but what I don't like especially is the fact that it's going to take up unnecessary meshing time, since these are still going to be under the floor and not going to be seen in the render. Ultimately might even cause some issues when we're rendering, because if we intersect our liquid mesh with the ground plane, then potentially the refracting is going to be broken. So we want to get rid of these actually. And the way we can do that is, rather than using the ground plane set in the flip sim, we can actually just add a big box as the floor that has a bit of thickness. Because if we go to the fluid particle surface, you see there's actually, under the regions tab, you can actually subtract the collision volumes. And the collision volumes right now is only our collider objects. Oh, that was a mistake. I should not have highlighted the merge, because that would force the flip solver to iterate up to the point of frame 14. Let me just hit the escape key until it stops cooking. Let's see if I managed to crash my Houdini. I did not. So let's go back to the color node. These are the collision volumes. So let's just add a big box. And that box needs to be at least as big as the sim, probably more. So let's make it 2 by 2 in Z and X, and it doesn't need to be too thick. Ultimately, we're not going to render it. We're only going to use it for collision, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to use the match size node again as a means of making sure it's exactly underneath the grid. So instead of putting the justify white to min, we're going to put it to max. And now this is underneath. So let's merge the match size with the copy to curves. And I think I'm going to do something a bit hacky and bypass the collider just for the sake of having this reference point maintained when I render. I don't want to render out that box. I can just render out a grid instead. So now we've changed that. And let's see if I go to the particle fluid surface again and let this cook for a bit. I'm actually going to go to a later frame just because it's maybe more interesting. And then go to particle fluid surface. And it's going to take a while. So I'll pause. So the meshing completed in about 5 minutes, which is way too long. Let's look at a few settings we can disable, but I also forgot to enable the subtract collision volumes. That's what we need to do in order to get rid of any particles inside of the collision volume of the box that we just created. I'm going to change my update now to manual, so it doesn't automatically change every time I change the setting. So subtract collision volumes, we're going to enable. Region voxel scale set to 4. Let's leave it at default for now. Container and closed boundaries. This is, I think, mainly useful when you have kind of a tank of liquid or pool that you're simulating inside, and this can kind of help with the sides and things. I don't think we need that, so I think it's doing a lot of magic that we don't need for this case. Let's just try. Let's just try. And now let's hit the refresh button. We're just going to build the mesh again. This is going a lot faster, I can already tell. It completed it completed in less than half a minute, so we made quite a speed up. Let's have a look at the below. Everything inside of the collision volume has been deleted. And yeah, I think it looks alright. I also see that we should probably make the box even bigger to include any particles lying around after the splash has kind of died out. So I'm changing that 4x4. And we're still looking at the particle fluid surface. So when I hit update, it's going to recompute. And it's going to take that bigger box into consideration. So now we have a healthy speed increase to the meshing. I'm not planning to go into a lot of details when it comes to the meshing. I do want to leave it at default as much as I can. But I think it's a good point now to start generating a few frames of mesh so we can debug the detail. We have 50 frames of sim completed. So let's go to the water balloon mesh, save the scene. And I'm just going to let this run, and then I'm going to be aware of canceling before it catches up with the particle cache. So save to disk in background. Make some room. And I'll be back when we have a few frames of mesh to look at. One thing I guess is good to point out is the fact that we're, caching the actual sim, which doesn't change the behavior of the particles when we edited the colliders upstream. But since the colliders are also being fed into the flip fluid compress and then the particles surface through that without bypassing the cache node, the collider objects are all actually live. And that's why we could, without changing the sim cache, we could update the surface to remove the box from as a collision object as well from the mesh. So it remains to, be explored what it would have meant to actually update the sim. That could also have, prevented the particles from ever traveling into that collider. But this was kind of a hack in this case. I still don't have enough frames of the mesh. I only have about 9 frames, but I can move the display flag to the water balloon mesh and go back to auto update to debug some of those early frames, so I just know where everything is at. We're still kind of falling down. So I guess one of the next few frames we're going to start getting some action. In the meantime, it shouldn't be too taxing to revisit our Solaris setup. So I'm going to go to Solaris view. We're still referencing the same objects really, the liquid sim, the colliders, and we have that grid plane we created. So let's see how this is all changing now. This is quite neat, I have to say. So there's the fact that we set everything up and we kind of referenced our nulls. We did a whole bunch of changes and our setup is still intact. And I'm just going to use these buttons here to go 1 frame at a time. See the updated meshes. I can already tell this is going to be quite nice to look at. Something that I think is going to contribute a great deal to the realism of this is introducing motion blur, especially on the liquid. And this is just not any old object that has been keyframed, since it's changing the topology of the mesh in every frame, the velocity needs to be transferred from the particles to the mesh, which is actually already happening on the particle fluid surface node. It's transferring these attributes: V, vorticity, rest, rest2, and CD. CD is just the color. The V is the velocity, and vorticity is something we're familiar with. It can be interesting to utilize in shading as well. So, to utilize the V attribute to introduce a bit of motion blur, let's just make sure first that this is a stage view. Oh, so when you enable this on the Render Geometry Settings node, you're going to see you start seeing motion blur now. And so this is without, and this is with the motion blur. If you're not seeing any motion blur, make sure that the no cam or whatever camera you have selected actually has camera effects enabled, otherwise it won't render motion blur end of the field. So probably what we want to do now, because I think that this is a little too, like on this frame it kind of works, but if I go back to, let's see, the impact frame, it is a little too intense, I think. So what you want to do is you want to edit this on an actual camera, and rather than trying to tweak the viewport camera, I'm going to lay down a camera, and you can now just control click the camera button up here. It's going to take the current view you have and place a camera in the exact same spot, and you can just move the view flag. You have the same result, but you're now looking through a camera. If you don't want to do that, or if you by chance happen to put down a camera right in the node network, that camera is going to be positioned at 0, 0, 0. So you're probably not going to see much. If we move this no cam to camera 1, and if you want to edit that camera, notice if I just alt middle mouse to pan, you'll see that it moves to no cam instantly. That's because you have the lock enabled to lock the camera to the view. So now that I start manipulating this, I'm actually going to move the actual camera. So now I'm starting to see something for debug's sake. And then when it comes to editing the effect of the motion blur, it's down to going to the sampling tab and changing the actual shutter duration or shutter, you know, there's multiple terms for this, but yeah, the shutter open and close. And typically for a centered motion blur, the open is the inverse of the close. I'm just going to do what we did before and just select this and click and drag relative channel reference, but I'm going to add the minus sign in front of it. So it's now going to update to the inverse of whatever I put in the close. And now if I want less of an effect from the motion blur, I can start dialing down this value. So the shutter close is going to be 0.1, the open is going to be -1. And if this doesn't update anything for you, then you might have to click under the perspective, click the restart render, and it's kind of re-tessellate the scene and take effect. So I'm probably going to have to go even lower. You should start seeing this is not blurring it out as much anymore. Now there are ways, of course, where you can actually manipulate the velocity attribute in itself, but I didn't want to get so specific in this case, since we're kind of doing a beginner's tutorial here. You can also hit tab and lay down a karma node, which is going to be necessary because all the render settings we're doing so far is just for the viewport, and the karma render settings node is necessary when we want to start thinking about outputting this to disk. So if I highlight it, it also comes with this USD-render ROP, which is what we're going to use in the end to actually send the command off to render in the background to disk. But we're going to highlight the karma render settings ROP. I'm going to leave the resolution to default and switch this one to XPU as well. And I'm going to leave the samples at 128. And you'll see here under camera effects that you can do motion blur here as well and enable velocity blur. Well, we did it with Render Geometry Settings node because we knew only the Render Geometry Settings, only the liquid incoming mesh had the velocity attributes. So we did it there instead. But if you do it on the Karma Render Settings node, you can do it for the whole scene at once. But we don't need these settings to interfere with each other. We'll just leave it as it is. And I have about 57 frames of meshing now, so we can go a little further ahead. See how the mesh is looking there. It's looking pretty interesting. Probably not the shading we're going to use in the end, and we're probably going to change a few other things. But in a frame like this, it's evident that, you know, even if there was high motion blur in that initial scene we were debugging, we probably want a bit more motion blur. So we actually see some motion blur in the later frames. This is quite interesting. I think I'm just going to render like one view in a landscape. Or maybe we'll do portraits. So we can fit this on Instagram or Square or something like that. But yeah, let's leave it at default for now. I'm going to leave the camera like this, and I'll uncheck the lock. So if I actually accidentally move the camera, I don't actually change the render camera. So probably gonna let some more meshing take place before I do any other changes. So I'll be back in a bit. This is something that can be nice if the light coming shining into the scene kind of reaches the camera through reflecting in the liquid. So I can either pivot the camera, or I can go to the dome light and starting spinning that around. So in the y-axis, I'm going to edit this 1 degree at a time and just let it kind of update. See, this is now starting to come closer. So now that I should hit the camera and kind of highlight the details on the mesh. We can actually add more lights if we want to. But let's maybe leave this as is for now and go to the material library for the water. And we currently have a pretty black surface. If we were to render this, let me go to the previous frame. Yeah, this just shows to me that there's not too much action worth rendering in the later stages. We're probably only going to render like 2 seconds or something, or 1 second at 60 FPS, and then render out the comp in 30 FPS, so we get 2 seconds. But let's look at one of these initial frames where there's a little more action and play with the shading on the mesh. So we saw before on the particle fluid surface node that we were transferring the attributes V, vorticity, rest, color diffuse. And the color in itself, remember that we were previewing this on the flip solver. We set it to color by speed, and it set the color of the particles to the speed of each individual particle. And this is then transferred as a color to the mesh. And we can utilize that in the shading by laying down a node called geometry color. So anything that's present at the point of reference under as a color is going to be imported here. And I can add this to base color. And just make sure I'm actually using base. This is now imported as a float. And it's actually a color. If we set a color, we can see the same kind of preview that we saw when we were simulating, but it's now been transferred to the mesh. This could be nice for something a little more stylized, if you will. But we can also utilize it as a float, as a value. You see that this is kind of looking, a bit hacky, and admittedly, if we were doing a sim where we want white water, we would be doing a sim in DOPS, because the SOP flip solver does not handle white water, and then we would be calculating particles. But we can also kind of cheat by shading the fastest parts of the mesh in a more opaque color, as it would in nature when kind of air bubbles kind of make it look a bit whitey and frothy. So you can use this as a way of actually controlling. So let's say we wanted to do kind of let's get rid of this for now and just enable subsurface. No, sorry, not subsurface. Transmission is the term for refraction. If we wanted this to be a refractive mesh, but we wanted it to be opaque where there's a high velocity. So we could then plug in the value from the geometry color into transmission. That's going to disable the refractiveness in those areas, but we kind of need to reverse this. Because now it's just doing the opposite, because it was bright or there's high velocity, and we want it to be, we're changing the value of the transmission, and we just want to flip this by this reverse. So that's going to mean we have a high transmission in areas where the velocity is low. Let's just kind of force this to restart. And then it's going to be opaque in areas where velocity is high. So let me make sure we have a base color as well. Base color is white. Let's see, something's not working. Do I need to tweak this? Just kind of tug it a bit. So now we have kind of cheated a water shader to have kind of like a fake whitewater. Something you can get away with from a distance, maybe. We can also utilize this as a means of, let's say we plug a ramp, and we can, there are a lot of useful presets. So if you press the cog here, you can use whitewater, for example, and we can use this to control the shading, the transmission color. So this is going to mean in the slow moving parts of the liquid, it's going to have these kind of deep blue color. And then the faster it gets, it's going to get kind of like aqua cyan. And then it's going to get all white and clear. But I think there's a lot of, it's a bit too much saturation in this. So let's drag down a color correct node, MtlX color correct node. Notably, it needs to be a MtlX node. Then I'm going to pull down this saturation. Saturation is going to play a lot into how kind of deep the color of the refraction is going to be. So I'm just going to force a restart. Maybe I actually just need to change the gamma. Maybe I'm just overcomplicating things. Let's get rid of that and just tweak the values independently. I want green to be more active. Starting to see a bit of green in those areas. And I want this to be not a super dark blue. I want it to be a bit more aqua. And pull down the saturation. Pull up the value. This is bright and transparent and pretty low. So, I mean, we're going really stylized on this one. This is obviously not very realistic, but it kind of shows how you can utilize some of the data that comes from the sim in a very useful way. And if you've been, playing with exporting real flow sims into Maya or Max or whatever, this is something that's been very limited, and the data hasn't, traveled across in a predictable way. So here you can just freely use the attributes that are being computed on the SOPs level and bring them right into the render. So that's also, a lot of people, I see a lot of people exporting their sims from Houdini to Cinema, for example, if they're like in the MoGraph community. Each to each their own, obviously, but I strongly recommend to render in Houdini because the flexibility and the power that you get is just amazing. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll do this, or maybe we'll do something entirely different, a little more like stylized. We could let's just duplicate this right now and have this one go into the output and get rid of the incoming connections. And then we can, instead, for the base color, let's grab the geometry color and add a color ramp. Let's say we want to go more stylized. We can do something similar to what we did with whitewater, but we're going to render this as opaque. So I just want to tweak this a little bit. Probably going to click this RGB, turns to HSV, hue saturation value, which I think is a lot more useful. Let's just change this a bit to be a little more stylized, and then utilize that as a base color, and then go in and get rid of the transmission. So now we should have the quick error areas are green shaded, and the slower areas are blue. The majority of the sim is blue, and then the quicker areas are going to be green and eventually white. And you can just kind of play with interpolation here to make the green more prominent. In other areas of Houdini, when you're playing with ramps, you can change the interpolation to be more smooth, but it just kind of defaults back to linear for me. So I just assume that inside of Karma it's not yet supported. But you can kind of get around this by adding more color stops if you want to. So we can do a little more stylized thing like this. Maybe even another stop that is a lot darker blue. And I think ultimately there's something wrong with the range of the values, since I'm forced to bring these also close together, but I'm not going to be too concerned about that for now. Yeah, I didn't like the blue one, so click and just pull that off. Kind of hard to explain exactly how you use these color stops, but it's just a bit of trial and error. Like click and drag to get a new color stop, click and drag it down to remove it, or click and select it to, and then hit delete. And then if you want to remove multiple at the same time, just click and shift click, and it's just going to give you several objects, several swatches selected, and just click another one to break the selection. So this could be useful and fun, but I'm not sure I enjoy the look of it. Maybe I'll just go kind of black and do some kind of like play with lava-ish. Not necessarily looking at all like lava, but just kind of stylized. This could be fun. The main takeaway is the ability to import attributes and utilize them in your shading, and the flexibility that comes with that. So, yeah, I don't know. Let's see. It's going to toggle back to the water shader. It's going to be one of these. I kind of want to make the scene a bit darker overall, so maybe it's going to be hard to tell with the water shader. Let's leave it to this and go back to the material library and change the ground material to something even darker. Very dark. And that one's very matte. We could play with adding a texture, but I think it's a bit beside the point for where we're at. It's something we can attack later on. I'm going to go to the pillars and make that darker as well on the base color, with the exception that it's more glossy and shiny. So maybe this is what we're going to be rendering in the end. I don't know. Maybe add a subtle reflection. You can also click this part of the search bar, which lets you toggle to one of the others in the same material library. We'll go back to the ground and go to specular and lower the roughness a bit. So we start making out some of the details in that background. And let's go back to stage and see the dome light is currently at default intensity. We can play with the exposure there. We could have kind of like a lower overall to have a pretty like murky scene, and then add a stronger area light somewhere. But I don't want to get too much into adding lights. Maybe I'll shoot just adding one. I definitely think it became a lot more interesting. So you can either just start typing area light here, or just control click to add a light, essentially where you're at with the camera. So this is now adding a light from the view of the camera. And if I uncheck the lock, you can use the viewport camera. And you can see that the area light is in the same position as the camera. And then you can choose to manipulate it with the tool handle, or you can split off a viewport to look through the camera. So I can make this a 2-view stacked. That apparently was really computationally intensive. Let's set this to a perspective as well. Set the top one to the camera, or rather the bottom one, sorry. Set the bottom one to the camera and set it to Karma. And then the top one is going to be Houdini-GL. And I'll just freely edit this. Now we can start dialing in the light. So just disable the dome light entirely. I'm just looking at the contribution from the area light now. And I can also choose to look through the light, area light, and then make sure you have the padlock toggle. So whatever changes you're doing here can be reflected. Maybe I'm going to be kind of trying to figure out this as a bounce. So now the light will kind of bounce like that. And let's just, for organization, leave it in between the dome light and the share library. Let's re-enable the dome light. And now I'm just not understanding at all what I'm doing. Let's see the share library again. I'll get rid of this into a single view. I'll make sure I have it to the camera, otherwise the camera is not going to show up as an option here. So now we're seeing a combination of the dome light and the light I just added. Tweak the exposure of that light. And then you might introduce some either color temperature or color stylized color. I like color temperature. I'm going to pull that down to get a bit warmer. I don't want it to be too obvious. And dome light, let's bring some of it back. See what it looks like on the first few frames. Yeah, that's really ugly. Our shader worked out very well on those later frames, but like initially it just looked like a snowball. So maybe we need to rethink the shader, or maybe keyframe a few of those attributes. I wonder. It looks really bad up until this point. So a way to get around that would be on the material library. I can go to one material, and we could either add a mix, so as a means of controlling the blend of the transmission. So the transmission is currently controlled by this ramp, which is brighter where the velocity is high. So if we use that as the foreground, and the background is going to be MtlX constant, which is the color, and that's always going to be black. So feed that into the BG, and if the mix always full refraction. So the BG is going to be full refraction. So when the mix is set to 0, it's full refraction. And then when the mix is set to 1 or higher, then the ramp is controlling it. So I think that's the way we're going to do it for this. So let's set it to 1 and figure out a frame where the shading actually started working out. Frame. At this point I definitely want that shading. So this is where it almost starts to make sense. So I'm going to go to here. I mean, I don't even know if it's going to make sense to keyframe this, but if I go to the frame 13 in my case, and I'm going to set a keyframe now by holding Alt on the keyboard and left clicking this. I'm just going to set the keyframe to 0. And then I'm going to go to a point where I think it's going to make sense to start introducing this. Or at this point, I basically want it to be full. So I'll set the value to 1, and then Alt left click again. Let's see frames in between. So here it's kind of like 85%. Here it's 50%. Here it's 0. Maybe that's going to make sense. Or maybe not. We're just kind of experimenting. Maybe. Kind of looks like a bit like there was some kind of sediment, like some flour or dirt or something mixed into it that kind of got stirred up at this point here. Or we should make the keyframes closer together. I don't know. So I've now let the meshing complete a bit further ahead. Let me just isolate the liquid and see how many frames we have. I don't think we're going to need to render more than a second, so since all the action kind of subsides here, so I think we're good actually. I'm actually going to wrap this at frame 60, and I'm going to later on I think we'll do it in Resolve, just do a few corrections in there. We'll output it as 30 FPS, and then we'll get it at half speed. Yeah, so I'm pretty much, the cache is still going, so I can just cancel out of that. The mesh is complete as well. Let's look at how to actually render this out to disk. I think I've done most of the things I set out to do here. I think what would be interesting, let's just see first of all how this is looking on the first few frames. Yeah, so the lump of liquid looks a lot better initially when it's not completely white. And there's a bunch of highlight traveling through it. I think maybe we want to consider doing this a bit later. Let's go to water material. And just shift middle click is going to bring up the graph editor for us. I think I want to offset this first keyframe. I can just use the wheel to zoom in. I'm just going to select that first keyframe and have it start at frame 14 rather than 13. So it's going to fade in from one frame later. I think that's going to look a lot better. Like this. But I mean, to each their own. One thing we might as well add is a bit of depth of field. And the way you do that is it's on by default. The only thing you really need to do is go to the sampling and provide some sort of f-stop. But before we do that, since it's not going to make any sense, default focus distance is 5, we're going to change that. So I'm going to disable the lock and navigate so I see the camera. And when I do that, make sure you have the view handle enabled. You can right-click this line here and enable the focus handle. The focus handle allows you to interactively set the depth of field. So you'll see this is where the current focus is, the focus distance. I'm going to leave it right there in the middle. You can maybe cross-check this a bit more directly from the side. And once I've set that, then I can start to dial in the depth of field using the f-stop. I'm going to go back to the camera. And just introduce a little bit of this. If you go really low, you'll of course discover that everything is out of focus almost. Kind of bring it up a little bit. Essentially, I want the focus to be on the ball where it lands in the middle. And then actually we could keyframe this focus distance as well. So I'm going to alt-click both the f-stop and the focus distance. I think this can kind of work. And once we get to the point of liquid actually escaping the pillar formation, I want to move the focus to the front. So I'm going to do that by changing it like that. And I'll go back to view it from the camera. I'll set a focus distance keyframe. And then let's see, do we want more in focus? I think so, because the back pillars are getting so very blown out. I just want it to be a little bit out of focus. Something like this. So let's visit some of the render settings before we now start to output this. By the way, I forgot to set a keyframe, so alt-click. Now on the camera render settings, XPU really just has these path rate samples. So it's still currently in beta. I think it's pretty stable, but there's not a ton of sample settings to make like in the CPU path tracer. What we can do is we can go to sampling and change the light sampling quality, and we can change the limits, which is usually something you need to do when it comes to transparent objects like this, because they kind of get these kind of black edges because we don't allow enough bounces for light to travel through the object. I'm just gonna try to increase this to something like 8 and 8. I don't think it's going to be much of a performance hit, and Karma handles these pretty well. I'm also going to go to geometry and shading and enable caustics, just because we can. It's usually adds something when you are retracing liquids like this. See if there's any light patterns. on the floor before it hits. Maybe it's not clear. I'm actually just going to render with caustic enabled, and we'll see if we can make out any effects of it. And the rest we're just going to leave. The only thing we need to do now is just render a test frame, because this is interactive, so this is continuously improving. We don't really know what 128 samples looks like. We're going to use this USD-render ROP node, and I'm going to leave it render current frame, and I'm going to render to MTLX. When I render to MTLX, it's going to take those 128 samples and render into our preview window. And since I'm already rendering to MTLX, I might as well pause this one. This comes up now. Looks a little different than what we're used to when we're playing back simulations. So it's gotten rid of some of the noise in the in-focus areas, but we can see in the out-of-focus areas it's still pretty noisy. You could, of course, run some kind of noise removal in comp, but I want it to be fairly grain-free before we proceed, with a good balance of quality. But it's still under 1 minute, which is not a lot, so I think we can go to 256 comfortably. And there is also denoising you can enable, but I'm not going to do that right now because I'm not too familiar with those settings. I'm just going to go to the render up and render to MTLX again now that we've doubled the sample. So it took a little more than a minute now. Still have these areas fairly noisy. I want to try to keep bumping it up. Since we only have 60 frames to render, this could complete within the hour of render times on average, like what we had before. So I don't mind spending 2 hours on this to render while I'm out of the house or something. So it's near completion now, and it's about 2.5 minutes, 2:20. I think the noise level is low enough where I'm going to be happy with this, since this is quite a lot of movement going on. I'm not sure how noisy this is actually going to come across as. So I'm probably going to stop the video now and leave this to render when I'm out of the house. So I'm probably just going to let this, I'm probably going to stop the render and let this run, and I'll be back with it. I'm just going to show you how we can now take this to disk rather than rendering to the viewport or MTLX. So I'm going to save the scene and highlight the USD-render ROP and change this from render current frame to render specific frame range. It's going to default to the start and end frames that we have set on the animation globals. And I don't really need to be too concerned about anything else in here. I just need to press render to, it's really render to disk or render to disk in background. I can just show you real quick. So once you press render to disk, it's going to bring up this little computation dialog that we saw before when we cached. And my only gripe with this is there's not a lot of verbosity in terms of what the status is. So it's really just showing us the time passed and which frame it's on. And yeah, I guess this might be kind of like a progress bar for the current frame, but it's not giving a lot of details. So what I like to do is using the render to disk in background. And it wants you to make sure you've saved. Can't be any unsaved changes, otherwise it's not going to launch. And nothing really happened, right? Well, if we bring up the task manager, we can see, if we sort here, we can see this an H batch, which is essentially the batch render going on in the background. But there's also this husk process, which is husk is kind of like a USD batch processing to disk, I believe. And it's using most of my CPU, and it's not quite representative, but the GPU is also being utilized since it's an XPU render. But also want to highlight that you can go to render and then scheduler. And if I clear my completed jobs here, you see the render that is currently running. And it's going to show you how much time has elapsed overall. It's also going to show you the percentage for the current frame. And I kind of prefer that for some reason. Maybe it makes more sense to see the progress for the entire job, but I like this. Gives me a sense of how quick each frame is. And I can always go to the directory that is being stored to and just see how many frames have come out. And we didn't really cover that, but I can close this and it's still going to complete in the background. In fact, you can even close Houdini, it's still going to run in the background. But it's handy to be in Houdini because then you can go to the scheduler. If you discover something wrong, you can kill the process here. But yeah, so on the Karma render settings is where you essentially set the output of the image, just as we did with the file caching in the previous tutorial. So important things to set here: if you have multiple cameras in your kind of LOPs in your Solaris stage, you want to set it to the one that actually upstream, but it defaults to camera 1, so that worked out really well for us in this case. But the output picture is going to go to the Houdini project, or the location of the HIP file, rather. And then the render subfolder, and then the file is going to be called HIP name, which is my first sim, .os, which is the object string, which is just Karma render settings. So I could have called this, water balloon render, for example. But I'm not going to change that now. And then .f4, $F4, which is just the current frame with a 4-digit padding. And then .exr, which is the default file format. We can click this one to kind of get to that folder and see there's 3 frames completed. I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to let this run now. The default render resolution of 1280 by 720, because we don't have the indie license, so we can't output any high resolution images. But I could have, for example, changed the resolution to a portrait if I wanted to. So I'll be back when the render is done. So it looks like the render is almost ready. Last few frames still working, but we can look at most of it. So I'm just gonna find it. So for these EXR sequences, you want to get yourself a player, kind of a video player that imports video sequences by default. And the by default part is really important, because then you can just click any frame and it shows up and loads the whole sequence. You can play it back. You don't want, to use maybe After Effects for this, where you kind of every time have to import and then create a composition and then preview. You want it to be, one-click solution. So the one I use is RV, which is included with Shotgun, but I kind of bought it as a standalone a few years ago, so I still have it. It's available as an open source tool now. I don't think they include binaries built, so you can just install it off the bat, so you might have to go through a few steps to install it. But it is a good tool to play back things like this. Otherwise, I feel it's kind of like not worth it. There are other tools like DJV, for example, which is free and pretty good. Where RV shines is it has, if you go into preferences, it has this extensive kind of like package distributions on their website where you can enable, even with the install, you can enable things like Maya support tools and OpenColor.io, which is what I really wanted to touch. So in RV, if you have sequence on file enabled by default, you just click one file, it loads the whole sequence, as long as it follows that naming convention of name.frame.extension. And then there's OpenColor.io, and that's important. So if you use RV, load this one, because as you'll see, this is a little pale compared to what I have in the viewport, and that's because it's not loaded with the right color space. And renders in Karma from Houdini are by default rendered using OpenColor.io, the ACES color space. So the way once you've loaded that package, you can go to OCIO, and in RV, you set the file color space to be ACES, and you have to activate it first. So ACES CG as the file color space, and nothing happens. We see we're on monitor 0, so you have to enable it on the monitor as well. So display 0, set it to active, and then set it to ACES sRGB. Should be what it needs. So now I can kind of see with the same kind of brightness as I saw the viewport. But if you can't get a hold of Army or build it, I mean, you can at least play back it in real time with DJV, and then you can bring it into Resolve, for example. Adobe has upped their game, and in the latest kind of versions of After Effects, it's quite good color management compared to at least what it used to be. But Resolve really shines at this, so I want to show you how to bring it into Resolve. And Resolve is also free, so you want to go to I don't know what the website is, but Blackmagic Design Resolve, Davinci Resolve. It's originally a kind of like a color grading suite, but it has the Fusion compositing framework built in, and it's a good nonlinear editor as well. So it's kind of showing me the splash screen on my other display here. I'm going to bring it over as soon as it loads. And I'm not really going to go through the theory of this or anything like that. There's people that have much better channels than me. But you just need to be aware that it's rendering in ACES CG, and you're viewing it in sRGB on your monitor, or if you have some kind of HDR monitor, maybe it's like Rec 2020 or something, or you're viewing it on a TV in Rec 709. So you need to set up your project in the right way. So when you come into Resolve, it's going to ask you if you want to use an existing project or create an untitled one. I'm just going to create an untitled one for the sake of this. I'm going to call it Houdini-tutorials. And I'm going to bring over the UI on this screen. So I want to start in the media page. And I first want to find that render that I have. So I'm going to go to that project folder. And that's the render. And then it shows the sequence as one entry. So you can just add it into the media pool. And then you can say create a new timeline using selected clips. And I'm just going to hit OK. And then I'm going to go to the edit page and just verify what this is looking like. So this is a very short timeline, so I have to kind of like scrub the zoom level here. So this is already a project. Let's go to File and Preferences. And sorry, I'm going to right-click the timeline and say Timelines, Timeline Settings. And the current project settings by default seems to be Ultra HD and 24 frames per second. I'm going to switch this. I mean, it can be, it can just scale your content to fit the view, but I don't want to scale that much. I'm going to go to HD, and I'm going to hit OK. I guess somewhere there's a project settings. So you go to File, Project Settings, and here I'm going to set it to be HD, and I'm going to set it to be 30, even if our playback, if our footage is 60. And then I'm going to go to Color Management, and this is important. So you want to set the color science to be ACCT. And once you've set that, you can set the ACES version. These are downloaded and installed with Resolve. 1.2 seems to be the most common one, so I'm just going to use that. And then I'm probably just going to leave it like this. And you know, if you want a little more elaboration on these topics, I highly recommend going to William Faucher's YouTube channel. He does a lot of Unreal tutorials and renders them in ACES and imports them in Resolve. And that's where I kind of pick these tips up. So I don't want to take the credit for that. I want to change the project frame rate, sure. And then on the timeline itself, or rather on the footage itself, you want to right click and go to ACES Input Transform, and then go down to Color Space Conversion, ACES, and then go to ACES CG CSC. And that's going to ensure that you get the same color information in the Resolve viewer, and also that you're working in the right color space so you don't mess up your colors or anything like that. This is the render. You know, I gotta say, before we do any adjustments to this, I gotta say, I mean, just considering the fact we did a pretty like faux whitewater shading setup, but we used minimal settings, and still, you know, some of these minute details, how the thin sheeting of water. I mean, obviously there are things to improve for future projects, but there's a lot of detail, a lot of bang for the buck here that we really would have struggled to get in other softwares. So it's just that good when you liquid sim in Houdini. But the only thing we want to do, we're not going to edit this per se. We're going to reload it at some point when the run is completely finished, so we get the entire duration. Maybe we will do that now. And then what I want to do is I'm not going to do any comping in the Fusion panel. I'm going to go to Color. And in the Color tab, this is kind of your input, these are your adjustment, and this is the output. So either you can do some adjustments on the actual node that's already there for us. So you can add, you know, color grading. Just make a slight kind of like contrast. And then I'm also going to add a, if you don't see this, then make sure that you're that you click your library here, so you can actually see the available nodes, and then you can search. And the one I want to search for is, sorry, I mean, if you only see this workspace, you want to click Effects, and then you get this library drop down. I'm going to search for glow. I want some glow, and that's just going to be on the very brightest part of the image. You can see it taking effect already, but I want it to be a lot more spread out. At any point you may want to see the before and after, you can click Control D on this one. And there's an opacity which we can use to kind of blend it. There's a global blend as well. If you lower the shine threshold, you get more glow. I just want to really like faint, kind of hazy. And these color and composite settings can be used to kind of really just work the work more glow into the image as a kind of like a pre-color correct. But really, the lower the threshold, the more glow. The higher the threshold, the less. And then the spread, and then you can kind of choose if you use the gain gamma controls or the opacity in the blend to kind of comp this in. I don't want too much. So I've done a basic color contrast on this one. I've done a glow. I want grain, but grain is not included in the free version of Resolve, so I'm going to use noise instead. Fast noise. It looks like shit to begin with, but we want to change the composite type to overlay, and then the scale to the minimum really. And then I'm going to set auto animation. Oh, that doesn't seem to animate. How about evolution? I guess I gotta put some keyframes on evolution. So I'll set it to 0, click this diamond there, go to the end, and just advance the property a bit to 1, and then, oh, it's auto keying. So here we go. And now, of course, this is way too much. I'm just going to put this to 5%, so 0.05. Oh, not 0.05, 0.05. So we get some grain. So yeah, there we have it. We added a basic glow, we added a basic color contrast, and we added some fast noise. Not really seeing it, so I'm gonna up it to 10%. And one of the best parts of Resolve is how fast it renders. So you go to the Deliver tab, and you can choose H.264 master, for example. It's going to set it to QuickTime H.264. You can go in MP4 if you prefer. And then the quality, make sure you set it to best. And you can even auto-upload to YouTube and things like that, which is pretty useful. But yeah, I'm really not going to do anything else than click Add to Render Queue. And it's going to ask me where I want it. I'm going to put it right where it's suggested in the My Documents Videos folder. And then I'm just going to render all. And of course, this is a 2-second frame. This is a 2-second timeline, but that's how quick it was. Now we can finally watch our render back together. So, even with this running at half speed, this is super quick, but we can see the work that we did come together nicely. Pretty nice to have a low kind of key light mirroring the reflections and kind of highlighting all the details. We see a little focus pull that we did. You see it starts in focus and then it kind of pulls it to out of focus. It's all really quick. That's also kind of nice. I think just the fact that we didn't make the scene too big just kind of adds to this feeling of the right scaling in a sense. And then, well, some of the kind of way it sticks to the pillars is nice, but that would probably be something that would improve with more resolution and more tweaking the friction and stuck on friction settings. But now we can say that we've done our first liquid sim project together in Houdini from, you know, an empty scene in Houdini, a ready-made template, and then render it out to a video file ready to share with your loved ones or your social media or wherever you prefer. So I already have a few more tutorials in mind, spin-offs of this topic that I want to continue doing. But if there's anything that you kind of got stuck at or, you know, related to this that you would love to see, then hit me up. It'd be good to hear how you feel I could improve the upcoming videos. And this is obviously, I mean, I haven't used it in production. I kind of do it for my own amusement. I'm happy to share what I've learned, and obviously I'm not, you know, as savvy as some of the videos out there. So if you have, I've seen a few tutorials myself. So if you are looking for a resource for something specific, some specific discipline or effect, then let me know in the comments, or you know, check out my Patreon to hit me up on Discord, for example. Yeah, but this is it for this one. I hope I'll see you soon again with another Houdini tutorial. Thanks for tuning in. If you find value in the stuff I'm putting out, please consider becoming a patron and supporting me. I've just done a revamp of the Patreon page. It's totally dead currently, but benefits include early access. You'll be getting to see the tutorials a few days ahead of everybody else. You can also utilize the Patreon video platform to see the tutorials. So at some point when I monetize this channel, hopefully, you won't have to sit through commercials if you're a patron. You're also gonna be getting access to scene files. I plan to do some exclusive contents, maybe a little BTS, just kind of ideas and work in progress, as well as setups that can make your life easier. You're also going to get, you know, any of the scene files relevant for free, of course. And if I at some point do any premium courses, I might be sharing that or discounting that for my patrons. There's also Discord, which is empty, of course, but a good place to come in and ask questions about the tutorials or anything you're working on, give suggestions for upcoming videos, as well as just chatting about CG and, you know, life in general. And I promise I'm not going to mute notifications or anything like that, so it's going to be the best place to get a hold of me. So thanks for your consideration.